As with many of these lectures, we have a bit of a warm-up act. So that was the haka, the most visible sign in kind of international culture of Polynesians and their culture. And they're one of three groups I'm going to talk about today. I don't know, how is New Zealand doing actually? They were doing quite well. Did they get knocked out?
It's this weekend.
It's this weekend they played France.
France, which would be a terrible game.
Okay. So you'll be able to watch the haka again. In fact, that particular shot there was of two Polynesian teams playing each other, both doing their equivalents of the haka, which is a bit unusual. So, starting with the Polynesians, we start with this question of where did humans get into Polynesia from? How did they get there? Let's step back and say, what's Polynesia before we answer that question? Polynesia is usually described as a triangle with the vertices here, Hawaii at the top, Rapa Nui, otherwise known as Easter Island, over here at one extremity, and New Zealand down there at the other extremity. So, how did humans get into this vast oceanic area? I mean, it is, the Pacific is the largest ocean, takes up, what is it, 1/6 of the planet's surface. These islands scattered around. How on earth did people get in there? How did they travel around and migrate within this region? Well, a few decades ago, there was this book called Kon-Tiki by a guy called Thor Heyerdahl, who said, they came from South America, and they came from the east, across here. And he actually built a raft using the kind of technology he thought that those early settlers would have, and showed that you could navigate using the currents and everything that were there in the Pacific from South America into Polynesia. The alternative suggestion is that the Polynesians actually came from the west, and that they came from Asia eventually, perhaps via other island groups, Melanesia, immediately to the west. So what's the answer? Well, it turns out that Thor Heyerdahl was a fantasist, and we clearly now recognise that the Polynesians came from the west. There is no convincing genetic evidence, human genetic evidence, for an occupation of Polynesia from South America. There is just this one small factoid, which is that you do occasionally see Native American Y chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA scattered among Polynesians. But this has an explanation in that there was a slave trade in Polynesia. Peruvians were captured and taken and put to work in various parts of Polynesia. And this is best explained as a bit of admixture from that population into current Polynesian populations, rather than any evidence of the original Polynesian migrations. There is other evidence, there's archaeological evidence. There's this so-called Lapita culture, which the archaeologists can track spreading through Polynesia and coming from the west, the oldest artefacts and evidence coming from the west, and then moving into the remote parts of Oceania, parts of Polynesia that were colonised later. There's also linguistic evidence. So again, this harks back to the previous lecture where we spoke about looking at Indo-Europeans and so forth. These guys here from New Zealand have actually looked at the affinities of the different languages of the Pacific and of the island groups bordering the Pacific, and what they actually conclude is that all the Polynesian languages are one subgroup of a larger family of languages that occupy parts of what's now the Indonesian archipelago, Papua New Guinea, and everything originates back in Taiwan. So although we now think of Taiwan as Chinese, there are actually Aboriginal groups in Taiwan that predate the arrival of the Han Chinese, and those groups speak languages which are allied to the languages of Polynesia. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how the dynamics of this migration, colonisation of the Pacific worked. This particular model that they put forward in this paper a couple of years ago was what they called a pulse pause model, where you get an expansion out from Taiwan into the Philippines and other parts of the Indonesian archipelago there, then movement, a pulse forward again, then pause again, and then more settlement, finally pushing them right out into the extremes of Polynesia, with New Zealand being colonised last. In fact, it's a bit confusing, this whole literature. There's not a single model that is actually accepted by everyone. Various hypotheses have been put forward, and they've all been given exciting names like out of Taiwan or the slow boat from Asia models. I think this is the best I can find in terms of a consensus of what happened. So we have about 5,500 years ago, these migrants speaking these so-called Austronesian languages, expanding out from Taiwan. They arrived down in Melanesia and New Guinea and the surrounding islands about 3,500 years ago, where there is genetic mixture with the local people and the development of this Lapita culture and cultural complex, and this Proto-Oceanic language, the kind of original Polynesian language. When you look at the genetic evidence, what you find is an interesting contrast between what Y chromosome sequences tell you and what mitochondrial sequences tell you. So the vast majority of the Polynesian mitochondrial sequences have affinities, the haplotypes are found in Asia. Whereas when you look at the Y haplotypes, the majority of those, 2/3 of them at least, come from New Guinea. About a third do come from Asia. So what this suggests is that there is differential admixture from when you compare the female and the male lines. So if you like, there is an original Asian population, and then there is a contribution of males from New Guinea, from Melanesia into that population. And this can kind of be reconciled with the cultures of this Austronesian population. Yeah, they have this so-called matrilocal residence. So the daughters stay where they are, and the sons move around. Men move around, men migrate. In fact, that's a common feature that we see elsewhere in human evolution as well. And also matrilineal descent, so the clan affiliation goes with the mother's side. There is this one mitochondrial lineage that actually is very common among Polynesians, the so-called Polynesian motif, this B4A1A1A mitochondrial lineage, and that appears to have originated in Polynesia, in Asia, even though it is now most common in Polynesia. But it's complicated. I try and boil down all the literature out there for you, and every year I find something that comes along and says, well, it's not quite that simple. Here's a paper I found recently where they said, well, this Polynesian motif that's found there in human mitochondrial DNA is thought to have come from Taiwan, but they here say it's perhaps not that simple, and that actually the motif might have originated in the Bismarck archipelago, and it's not quite so straightforward. As with out of Africa, in terms of the peopling of the Pacific, we do actually have other lines of evidence, not just human genes. We have evidence here from Helicobacter pylori again. So the same group that did that study looking at H. pylori genetic diversity across the whole world have focused in on the Pacific. And they have drawn this conclusion that in fact there are these two large distinct populations of H. pylori, which they call HP sahul and HSP maori, and that HP sahul split off from Asian populations around, well, a long time ago, 31 to 37,000 years ago, whereas this second human expansion, as they say, going along with the consensus from genetic information, is that there was an expansion out of Taiwan 5,000 years ago and brought this particular HSP Maori clade lineage of H. pylori into Melanesia and Polynesia. So this is their picture of what happened. Here they're looking at the percentages of individuals, the proportion of individuals in each location that carry the particular subtypes of H. pylori, and you can see this HSP Maori here. Obviously, given its name, it's actually most common among Maoris, but there are populations in Asia there, in East Asia that have this, and particularly looking at Taiwan, you see it in these Aboriginal populations there. Similar kind of lines of evidence trying to dissect the movements of humans in the Pacific come from other animals that accompanied the humans as they moved out. Here's one where they looked at rats, Pacific rats, and they came up with this conclusion that the earliest colonisation was here in the centre, and then you got movement out to the periphery down to New Zealand, up to Hawaii. But some evidence that it wasn't just in one direction, and this is an interesting question as to, you know, were these colonisation events, or migration events, were they just a group of people that shipwrecked and blown there, or was there actual movement between these island complexes, substantial movement over long periods of time? And this is a lively area of debate, and we'll say more about it in a few minutes. Here's another paper that sort of looks at the same issue, and again looks at this. They say we compare ourselves with the Lapita models of oceanic settlement. We can reject too often simplistic models, finding support instead for multifaceted models, incorporating a more complex view of the Lapita intrusion. So there isn't a quick and easy take-home message from these studies. It looks as if the whole thing was rather more complicated than we perhaps would like to think. Here, pigs. Pigs also travelled with the Polynesians, and there is this difference between the pigs that colonised these parts of the Pacific and the adjacent islands, and then the ones that actually came out and went into Polynesia. So clear differences in these two lineages. This study looked at chickens, and actually looked at chickens in South America, pre-Columbian chickens, supposedly, from South America. And they came up a few years ago with this remarkable conclusion, which was that these pre-Columbian chickens, or pre-Columbian chicken lineages at least, from South America were allied to chickens found in Polynesia. And this is it's a very provocative conclusion. We know that these were a remarkable people. The Polynesians did colonise just huge expanses of ocean and moved huge distances across the Pacific, all the way to Easter Island, which you can just about see there. It's not too much of an extrapolation to think, well, maybe they did actually make all the way across and perhaps settle in South America as well. Sadly, this story actually was not found to be true. I mean, I think the consensus now is that actually they misinterpreted their results, and fresh analyses that have been done on those breeds have actually concluded that chickens from South America are more closely related, all of the chickens from South America, including breeds that seem quite native to the place, actually have affiliations with European, Asian breeds of chicken, and they have been introduced post-Columbus with the European colonisation of the continent. This picture comes from the end of the 19th century and is very controversial in New Zealand. It depicts, in the mind of these Europeans, the arrival of the Maoris in New Zealand. Now, there are some political subtexts here. The Maoris arrived a few hundred years before the Europeans. The Europeans, it's not my view, but I think there is a kind of view there that expressed in this that, well, maybe the Maoris shouldn't have got there. It would have been more convenient if they hadn't been there and the Europeans could have the whole of New Zealand to themselves. And this is depicting the Maoris arriving as a bunch of starving wretches. They kind of got there by accident. They kind of don't really belong. You can see that subtext. And this is an extremely touchy and heated subject in New Zealand, particularly among the Maoris and their relations with the European settlers. So, what is the evidence about the arrival of the Maoris? The Maori cultures say they arrived in a number of canoes, so-called waka, that arrived kind of en masse in a kind of planned colonisation, in contrast to what's shown in this picture. So here's a paper that came out quite a few years ago now in PNAS looking at this particular issue, and they tried to work out, looking at mitochondrial haplotypes and the variation seen among Maoris in those haplotypes, how many original female Maoris there were in the original settlement of New Zealand. And they came up and they said this is consistent with their founding population that includes 70 women, between 50 and 100. And they say that this is too large for people just to be blown there by the wind. And it is in fact, it's not just a castaway population. It's consistent with the general understanding of Maori history, oral history, and the results of recent voyages, that actually this was a planned transoceanic voyage with people arriving en masse as a planned migration and settlement. Here's a paper that came out a bit more recently. They tried to finesse these numbers and actually came up with a slightly larger number. So they say approximately 190 women, between 170 and 230 present in those founding waka canoes. More than double the previous estimate, and again, this fits well, they say, with Maori oral history, and it means that this was not an accidental discovery, but this was a proper settlement. Okay, so moving on from the Polynesians, now going to consider another group among the diversity of human populations, and again we have a little video introduction just to set the scene. So that is the Hasidic hip-hop artist Matisyahu singing about Jerusalem, and the Jewish people for many, many generations, many hundreds of years, wherever they are in the world, always look to Jerusalem and to Palestine as their spiritual and ancestral homeland. But they haven't really lived there en masse for 2,000 years. So is this belief actually grounded in genetics? It's a cultural belief. What does the genetic evidence tell us? Well, this is a paper, again, quite a few years old now, looking at these kind of issues. And in the Jewish tradition, although currently Jewishness passes down on the maternal side, there are subpopulations among the Jews where it passes on where traditions pass down the male lineage, and one of those is the priestly tradition. So you may have heard of Jewish people called Cohen. Cohen is the name of the priestly caste in Judaism, and the plural of Cohen is Cohenim. These Cohenim, they actually pass the tradition down from father to son. And so if you look at Y chromosomes, what do you find? What would you expect to see? Well, this study here done by Mark Thomas and others, they said that there indeed was this particular common haplotype among the Cohenim, subsequently called the Cohen modal haplotype, and they said that even if you look at very different kinds of Jewish populations, so there's this big distinction between so-called Ashkenazi Jews, those that have recent European ancestry, particularly Eastern European and Germany, and Sephardic Jews, which dispersed around the Mediterranean from Spain after their persecution. Those two populations have been quite separate for hundreds of years, but nonetheless, they still, among the Cohenim in these groups, they have this concentration of one particular Y chromosome haplotype. It's not to say that all of the Cohenim have this, but it is much more common in the Cohenim than in other groups. And they actually tried to work out when was the original, what was the ancestor, the most recent common ancestor of all those Cohenim that have that particular haplotype. And they came up with an idea about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And they made the point that this actually goes with the Jewish tradition, which is that the Cohenim are actually male descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, and that's about the right time, about 3,000 years ago. So this was a nice kind of story for Jewish people and to actually show that, yes, there is a relationship, a genetic relationship. Another group among Jewish kind of religious caste is the Levites. And here the thing was, the conclusions were a little bit more murky and a little bit less reassuring, if you like, that everything went back to Palestine 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. In fact, what they showed was there were multiple origins of these Levites, and among the Ashkenazi Levites, in fact, they don't appear to be related to Near Eastern Levantine populations, but actually appear to be more related to Europeans. And they say that there's probably a very common ancestor about 2,000 years ago. So there's some kind of founding event where one or very few European men actually came into the Jewish community and actually became the ancestors of now over 50% of the Ashkenazi Levites. One of the most intriguing, even bizarre stories within the kind of world story of Judaism is the idea that there are some Africans who claim to have Jewish ancestry. There are two main groups that make this claim. They're the Lemba, and these are Bantu-speaking people in southern Africa. They claim that they have Jewish ancestry. They have some customs that are similar to what we see in Judaism. They're circumcised, they celebrate the Sabbath, and so forth. And then there's another group, sometimes called the Falasha, although I think now the politically correct term, the preferred term, is Beta Israel for these groups. These are Ethiopian Jews, and they claim to be descendants of the tribes that came to Ethiopia with Menelik I, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And So when we look at the genetics, what does it tell us? Is there any evidence for these claims from when we look at gene sequences? Well, it looks like there is. For the Lemba, again, this is a paper from Trevor Jenkins quite a few years ago, actually said that if you look for the Y chromosome, look at the Y chromosomes of the Lemba, more than 50% of them actually appear to be what is called Semitic in origin, around 4% are Negroid. So the fact that there appears to be this large proportion of the males in that population having this particular Y chromosome does actually support their lineage, that their oral traditions, that they actually walk their way through Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. In their oral tradition, there's a place that's been tentatively identified as Senna in Yemen, and they walk their way through down to southern Africa. And this Cohen modal haplotype that I mentioned earlier, if you look for that in the Lemba, you actually do, again, find evidence for this tradition here. So they come from this place, Senna, identified as Sana in Yemen. And when you look at the priests within this particular group, you find that there is a concentration of this Cohen modal haplotype. So one of the Lemba clans carries a very high frequency the Cohen modal haplotype, characteristic of paternally inherited Jewish priesthood. This again supports the idea that there was a group of people who had Jewish origins, Jewish traditions, that were this kind of seed lot for this particular group. There is obviously evidence of admixture from the local populations, from African populations as well, but the idea that the oral tradition does appear to have been substantiated by these genetic studies. Unfortunately for the Beta Israel, Falashas, the story appears to be different. So these Ethiopian Jews actually appear to have genetic background which is closely related to that of other Ethiopians, and don't appear to have any Jewish ancestry in the sense of genetic ties to modern Jewish populations. This is a Falasha from the Beta Israel in Israel, serving in the Israeli Defense Force. And one of the most controversial things that happened in the history of Israel was that back in the 1980s, during the famine, the one that Bob Geldof and that stuff, the Israelis went in and airlifted out large numbers, pretty much the whole population of these Ethiopian Jews, and took them to Israel. But then when they got to Israel, it turned out they weren't actually considered Jewish enough, and they had to then all convert and go through some conversion process. So it's very interesting the way in which these kind of ethnic affiliations and the genetics and recent history all kind of intertangle and create a bit of a mess, really. Papers appear quite regularly on this subject now, actually. Here's one paper that came out a couple of years ago where they looked at the genome-wide structure of Jewish people, looking at very large numbers of genetic loci, and they produced this very interesting map, if you like, of diversity among the Jewish populations, and they showed that there was overlap with some Middle Eastern populations, but actually distinctness as well from some of the others. And around the same time, another paper came out looking at the question of diaspora Jewish populations, and showed that actually these populations were fairly distinctive. Occasionally there was appeared to be some affiliations with European populations, but also some affiliations with Middle Eastern populations like the Druze, particular group that's found in Israel and Syria and so forth. and with Palestinian Arabs. Just to summarise that in more detail, paper by Axman, what they did was they did these genome-wide analyses of 7 Jewish groups, and they compared them with non-Jewish groups, and they found these distinctive Jewish population clusters, shared Middle Eastern ancestry, and variable degrees of admixture from the local populations in Europe and North Africa. And they found 2 major groups, so they could separate Jewish populations into those that were Middle Eastern and those that were European/Syrian. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned as part of the background to all this is that was a theory put around by Arthur Koestler about 40, 50 years ago, which said that actually the Ashkenazim, the populations from Eastern Europe, weren't actually they had no genetic relationship to Palestine at all, and that they were actually descendants of a group known as the Khazars, Khazar, who lived on the Black Sea. And there was documentary evidence that the king of that particular country adopted Judaism as the national religion, and there were lots of converts. So his view was that, well, perhaps that was the basis of this population in Eastern Europe. So this is really, we're now seeing that hypothesis is wrong. It's not true. And it does appear that there is some substance to the idea of the Jewish people being one people with common ancestry in line with their tradition. The other thing is that there's this I'm trying to remember. This identity by descent analysis, which is what they use, they showed that actually there was a decay in the Ashkenazi genomes, where you see some signatures there which actually are consistent with a severe bottleneck. So it looks as if the Ashkenazi population actually was at one stage very small. And there is this thing that's not quite explained, that back in the 15th century, perhaps there were only 50,000 Jews living in Eastern Europe and parts of Germany, whereas now there are 5 million. So there was this massive population explosion during the history of the Ashkenazim. This other paper, Behar et al., they used high-density beta race to genotype 14 Jewish populations and 68 Old World non-Jewish populations, and used various methods. And they found that most of the Jewish samples were in tight subclusters. They overlay the Cypriot and Druze samples, so had a Levantine or Near Eastern origin, but they didn't actually particularly go closely with other groups from the Levant or from the populations where they were actually living. And they also confirmed that the Ethiopian Jews were not related particularly to other Jewish populations and clustered instead with the local populations. Among I didn't mention this before, there's also a group of Jews in India known as the Bene Israel, and these claim that they have been in India for many hundreds, over 1,500 years, and their ancestry is a little bit less clear. It does appear that there is some evidence of a paternal link, Y chromosome link between the Bene Israel and the Levant, but in more general terms, when you look at large numbers of loci, they appear to have an affiliation with the local Indian population. So it suggests, perhaps there were a very small number of Jewish people that went there and founded a population that experienced large degrees of admixture from the local people. Okay, the last group I'm going to talk about is this group here, rather strange kind of tribe. This is my own observations, not too far from here, a couple of summers ago, watching these individuals do their kind of native dances. I am, of course, talking about the English. And so where did the English come from? And how did they get to be here? So this paper here is an interesting paper, looks at this issue. Again, this is from Mark Thomas's group down at UCL. He was also the one that was behind the initial studies on the Cohen. And if any of you are interested in following up on this subject, we don't actually do research in this kind of area in Birmingham, but Mark Thomas, I'm sure, will be delighted to hear from you. In fact, 3 or 4 years ago, one of the students from here did go and do a PhD with him. So contact Mark Thomas at UCL if you're interested in doing more of this kind of stuff. Now, what I have here is I'm actually going to take a rest, so my voice has a rest, and let someone from this group actually talk you through their work. So let's see if this is going to work now. It should do. It did work the last time I looked. Oops. And in here, and in here, and off we go.
My name is Dr. Mike Wheel, and in this talk I will describe our Y chromosome evidence for Anglo-Saxon mass migration. This study was performed by the Centre for Genetic Anthropology and published in 2002 in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. The Anglo-Saxon cultural transition is perhaps the most well-known and best studied of the many cultural transitions that have occurred in British history. The major cultural transitions include post-glacial hunter-gathering, the introduction of farming, and the successive introduction of Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman cultures. There has been and continues to be much debate among historians and archaeologists on the role which migrations play during these cultural transitions. One extreme viewpoint would be that cultural transitions are brought about entirely by the mass immigration of a new group, bringing their culture with them and entirely replacing the indigenous peoples and their culture. The opposite extreme viewpoint would be that migration plays no role whatsoever in cultural transitions, with ideas, but not people, flowing in from the outside. In most cases, the available evidence from historical records and archaeological sites is capable of being interpreted from either viewpoint, and so the role of migration in cultural change remains uncertain. The one exception in our table is for post-glacial hunter-gatherers, and this is simply because Britain was uninhabited at the height of the last ice age, so migration must have played a role there. A relatively new source of information that can be used to address this issue is that found in the DNA variation of people living in and around Britain today. Studies to date have already looked at what are known as classical markers, such as blood groups, serum proteins and isoenzymes, and genes involved in immunity. And they have shown that the frequency of different types of these genes varies in a systematic way from one part of the country to the other, often forming gradual trails known as climbs. These have been interpreted as reflecting migration patterns from continental Europe, but formal testing of alternative migratory models has not been attempted. This is because it is very difficult to test alternative hypotheses on the timing of historical events based only on data on the frequencies of these classical markers. A way around this problem is provided by study of the Y chromosome. The reason for this is that, on the one hand, it acts as a single locus in the human genome, since it is passed from father to son to grandson, and so on, without ever experiencing recombination of the majority of its length. On the other hand, the Y chromosome is a huge stretch of DNA 60 million base pairs long, so within this single locus are an exceptionally large and varied collection of variable markers. These include so-called UEP, or unique event polymorphisms, the result of rare mutations occurring only once in human genealogical history, which can be used to divide men into different genealogical clades called haplogroups, as depicted in this network. Y chromosome markers also include microsatellites, or short tandem repeats, unstable sections of DNA which mutate relatively rapidly, and which can be used as a sort of molecular clock to date the timing of events occurring within historical times. For this study, we used the 11 UEP markers and the 6 microsatellite markers listed here to address the question of whether the Anglo-Saxon cultural transition also coincided with male migration from the continent. To look at this question, we chose our sampling design carefully so that different patterns of migration from the continent could be distinguished. The transect design allows any possible climb to be characterized along this axis, and to distinguish points where any sudden change in DNA variation takes place. The towns were selected because they are long-established market towns with relatively small populations, mentioned in the Doomsday Book of 1086 AD, that are less likely to be influenced by recent migration than large cities. Samples were analysed if both the donor and the donor's paternal grandfather were born within 20 miles of one of these market towns. In addition to the 7 towns along the UK transect, we also took samples from 2 areas outside the UK. Friesland is thought to be one of the source locations for Anglo-Saxon immigration, both because of its geographical location and because Frisian is the closest extant language to Old English. Norway represents one source of the Viking invaders. All samples were obtained with informed consent from healthy adult volunteers using a mouse swab to collect the DNA. All records were anonymised after collection. Our results are summarized in this principal coordinates plot, which is a method for compressing multidimensional information into 2 dimensions. The information in this case is the degree of genetic distance measured by RST between samples collected in different places. Specifically, RST measures the differences one finds in microsatellite sizes between samples collected in one place and samples collected in another. The plot illustrates 3 clear patterns that were also confirmed by statistical tests. The first of these is that there is little genetic differentiation among the English towns, which all cluster together in the same part of the plot. The second of these is that, in contrast to the English towns, the 2 Welsh towns are significantly differentiated both from each other and from the 5 English towns. Finally, in contrast to the Norwegian sample, which is separated from the others, the Frisian sample is very closely allied to the English samples and appears in the same cluster on the bottom left. Indeed, bootstrap tests reveal that the English males in our samples are more closely related to the Frisians than they are to the North Welsh. While the patterns revealed by the principal coordinates analysis are remarkable and interesting in their own right, they do not by themselves indicate the nature, scale, or timing of events that generated them. To address these issues, a simplified model was devised of the possible demographic interactions that could have occurred between the English and the Frisian male gene pools. The first of these is a common origin from the same parental population at some point in the distant past, followed by a split into the separate English and Frisian populations. The second of these is the possibility of a small but continual amount of background migration between the 2 populations once they are formed. Finally, there is the possibility of a large, one-off mass migration event occurring at a particular point in time from one population to the other. We explore this model by setting the parameters at different levels to see what combination of factors could plausibly explain our data. The first question we asked ourselves was whether a mass migration event was needed to explain our data. In other words, could our results be plausibly explained by the action of background migration only? We started by assuming that English and Frisian males all descend from the same common population 240 generations ago, at the same time that agriculture was being introduced into Northern Europe. This assumption is almost certainly false and almost certainly too recent, but it is made so that the level of background migration can be as small as possible. The assumption is therefore conservative with respect to the conclusions we shall be drawing here. Having made this assumption, and assuming the mass migration event, we found that the amount of background migration needed to be between 0.3% and 50% per generation in order to generate the very high genetic similarity we found between the English and Frisian men. We believe that even the lower estimate in this range of 0.3% is still too high to be a plausible value for the background level of migration. For one thing, this value is 3 times higher than the known immigration rate into the UK from the entire EU region over the past 25 years, a time period where arguably international travel has been greater than at most times in the past. For another thing, while 0.3% does not sound like very much, it acts cumulatively from one generation to the next. So if this figure were correct, then 1 in 6 English males would descend from Frisians who had immigrated since 500 AD, a proportion that would reveal itself in the genealogical records. Our conclusion, therefore, is that we do need a mass migration event in order to explain the very high English-Frisian genetic similarity. The next question we asked ourselves was, when did this mass migration event need to take place, given that it occurred? Again, to allow our time frame for this event to be as wide as possible, we conservatively assumed an extremely large background migration rate of 0.1% per generation, and the most extreme mass migration event possible, one involving 100% replacement of the English male gene pool. Both these assumptions allow the upper limits of the event to be as far back in time as possible. Using these assumptions, we found that the mass migration event could have occurred at any time in the past 2,500 years. While this does not mean that the Anglo-Saxon cultural transition is the only period consistent with this event, it does mean that it is a plausible candidate, and indeed, based on the available historical and archaeological evidence, it is the most plausible candidate. Finally, we asked the question of how big the mass migration event had to be, under the assumption that it did in fact coincide with the Anglo-Saxon cultural transition. We again conservatively assumed a background migration event of 0.1% per generation, and assumed the event took place around 60 generations ago. We found that the contribution of Frisian males to the English male gene pool had to be at least 50% at that time, and may even have been 100%, i.e. complete replacement. Either way, the event was big, and certainly qualified as a mass migration. In conclusion, we found that a large Anglo-Saxon mass migration event was the best explanation for the high genetic similarity between English and Frisian males. This conclusion also fits with the observed genetic dissimilarity between Englishmen and Welshmen, since Anglo-Saxon culture spread throughout England, but not into Wales, a country which maintained political independence from England until the 13th century, and which to this day celebrates a distinct Celtic-based culture and language. This study shows that the Welsh border was more of a genetic barrier to Anglo-Saxon Y chromosome gene flow than the North Sea. Remarkably, we find that the resultant genetic differentiation is still discernible in the present day, despite recent trends in mobility. These results indicate that a political boundary can be more important than a geophysical one in population genetic structuring, and that informative patterns of genetic differentiation can be produced by migration events occurring within historical time.
Okay, I've just got a couple slides now to finish. One of the reasons we don't get handouts for this lectures in advance is because everything is done at the last minute to make sure it's as topical as can possibly be. Has anyone seen the BBC website this morning? In discussion on there about whether this document, Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, was actually legal or not. It was penned by Thomas Jefferson, shown here, and there's been this lively discussion between a bunch of British lawyers and a bunch of American lawyers saying, was it legal or was it not? And the British lawyers say, of course it wasn't legal. The things they were arguing about were fairly trivial anyway, and the only arguments they had against the charge of not only being illegal to declare independence but being treasonous was things like these truths are self-evident. And all men are created equal is one of those self-evident truths that was put into this declaration. Funny thing is that the guy who actually said that, all men are created equal, and created this wonderful constitution, Declaration of Independence, to inspire the world, actually kept slaves. No, that's bad. From today's perspective, it's a very bad thing to be doing. But he did something even worse than that. He had sex with his slaves. It appears that he had a long-standing relationship with one of his slaves called Sally Hemings. Now this is what the historical record says, and what all the rumours say. Is there any genetic evidence for it? And this is where we bring these Y chromosome studies right up to the current day. And in fact, what they showed a few years ago was in fact that one of the lineages of descendants from the claimed Jefferson ancestry did indeed have a Jefferson Y chromosome, whereas the other lineage didn't. And this basically at the time was said, right, that's it. We have in Banter rights, not only was this guy a hypocrite for writing all that stuff and then keeping slaves, but he also engaged in what we would now call statutory rape. He was using his position of power to have sex with his slave. And in fact, there's been a huge amount of political problems with this because the white descendants of Jefferson are actually buried, allowed to be buried in the cemetery at his house in Montebello. The black descendants have been excluded. So you think that's it. In fact, of course, those who want to defend Jefferson have fought back very quickly and said, well, hang on. All you've shown is the Y chromosome is the same Y chromosome as Thomas Jefferson, but you haven't shown it was him that was doing those naughty things with his slave. It could have been his other male relatives. So there's this idea that it could have been, what was it? Simplest explanation was the father, but the most likely father was not Thomas Jefferson, who was 65 at the time that this child was born, but his brother, Randolph, who was 12 years his junior. He lived 20 miles away, but often did visit the Jefferson home. So maybe there was, an illicit liaison during one of those visits. It's also possible that Randolph's son could have actually been implicated as well. So the case is kind of, probably it was Thomas Jefferson, but we can't say beyond all reasonable doubt. Interestingly, another little twist on this in terms of Jefferson's Y chromosome lineage is that they're actually a very rare one among Europeans, and in fact shows affiliations with the Middle East, and particularly with an Egyptian haplotype. And this gives us a cautionary tale that actually, maybe looking at your ancestry through chromosomes and so forth may not always be reliable. And this study, they showed that although there was this affiliation with Egypt, if you look at other people called Jefferson, they also have this haplotype. It does appear that this is quite an ancient haplotype among Europeans. Almost finished now. Let me just end up by saying that we've emphasised human diversity and difference during these lectures, but it's worth reinforcing the idea that race is actually a social construction, a political construction. Richard Dawkins has kind of highlighted this. If you look at this guy here, Colin Powell. You don't hear much about him these days. Is he a black man? What do you think? Well, Dawkins' view was, well, if you look at Colin Powell here, next to a real African, someone who has clear and recent African ancestry, you can see that he looks much more like this kind of guy here than he looks like this kind of guy there in terms of his pigmentation. And it's clear that there's a lot of still racist thinking. We mentioned this picture before, and I'd just like to leave you with the idea that actually, although I kind of diss Jefferson, the ideas that he left behind in the Constitution actually have become some of the most inspiring ideas that have ever struck humans in the last few hundred years. And of course, this fed into this idea that all men are created equal, fed into Martin Luther King's famous words in his I Have a Dream speech here, which I'd recommend you go and have a good read as a tonic against any ideas of biological predestination and kind of racism. And one last thought, what about this guy here? What's his racial affiliation? Well, he was born in Hawaii, first Polynesian American president. If you want to look at it that way, or first Hawaiian president. In fact, one of his ancestors is buried just a few miles down the road, close to where I live, in Worcester Cathedral. He actually descended from King John. And so, he is half white too. So those of us who have this kind of pale European skin can also claim him as one of ours if we want to. It's all a bit silly doing that. Basically, the ideas are more important than people's origins. That's me finished. Thank you.